Welcome to the third video in the type mapping series. Those who may have watched the previous videos will appreciate that type mapping takes a dynamic view of personality. It addresses the question of how people behave differently in different situations. And it does this by reducing the overlap and hence the confusion between personality and role. It clarifies the fact that personality is part of our sense of identity and role is how we adapt our behaviour to meet the challenges we face. This video will elaborate on why there is a need for a different kind of personality questionnaire and how the TDI provides a clear but simple way to explore the differences between our inner nature and our role behaviour. Here is what I will cover. Why develop TDI in the first place? I would explain some of the limitations of current personality questionnaires and how the TDI addresses them. I will then go on to why use a type approach, and I will tell you more of the theory underlying the TDI and the benefits of a type approach. Then I will explain how TDI and type mapping integrate with the concept of people's identity, a fundamental concept. And finally, I will summarize why develop the TDI. The TDI story begins from a dissatisfaction with the way our concepts of personality have been shaped by a psychometric approach which is limited or even flawed. It's not that self-report questionnaires aren't useful, they are. But are we trying to emulate science and objective measurement appropriately? The traditional psychometric approach has modelled its concepts of reliability and validity on the physical sciences, initially in the measurement of intelligence. And the various statistical processes used are based on the assumption that what we are measuring is inherited or at least stable. But even if we accept these assumptions, I would argue that the approach has not been appropriately adapted for our current focus on personality. I have elaborated on these ideas in other videos. See part 1, an overview of type mapping, or From Shakespeare to Gogglebox, both of which can be found on YouTube. These will further explain the birth of the type mapping system and the development of the TDI. In my talk, From Shakespeare to Gogglebox, I explained how not all numbers can be treated the same, and I introduced the idea of hard numbers and soft numbers. And let me give you a shortened illustration of what I mean. We need to recognize different people give the same rating, let's say a 5, and that does not always mean the same thing. So if you consider these three people, all rating I like change as a 5. One means this, another means that, and a third means this. This illustrates how self-report questionnaires, through its invitation for you to tell me about yourself, can make it easy to forget that the result is not their personality, but their self-perception, their story about themselves. The questionnaire simply extracts and then systematizes that story. Once this is acknowledged, it becomes clear that their story depends on many things, such as their current level of awareness or their life experiences. And few people deny that life experiences don't change us. Please note, I am not saying that there are no constitutional factors that shape our personality. I believe there are, and that these can make some things hard to change. But this does not detract from the point, which is that the questionnaire evidence is not measuring DNA. The type mapping system has therefore been developed to free us from the static view of personality developed through traditional psychometric methodology, so that we have a way to monitor and understand that change. And there are more reasons for developing the TDI, some of which I will summarize at the end of this video. But one issue I want to address now is why the TDI does not present personality in the traditional way as a profile like this. Those who have watched part 1, the overview of type mapping, may remember the argument against using some generalized average on a continuous scale. since people usually recognise that they do have elements of both ends of the scale, maybe at different times. And the overuse of the average is eloquently criticised in the book by Todd Rose called The End of Average. A more interesting and probably realistic view of personality was developed by Carl Jung with his theory of opposites. He recognised that our makeup is more like a mosaic of characteristics, and he observed that some of these characteristics sometimes compete for expression. So our psyche seeks some kind of balance, not as an average, but as a dynamic balancing act. To further help understand his theory of opposites, I will use an analogy. We know that water can flow both ways in these pipes, but they cannot flow both ways at the same time. Hence, finding a person's preference is like asking for the angle of tilt. This tells us in which direction the water flows most easily and naturally. Of course, circumstances can change, and they do change, and we may need to reverse the tilt for a while. This changes the direction of flow, and this may take effort. We may even need a pump to push the water in the other direction. So if we replace water with Jung's concept of, say, introversion and extroversion, then a preference for one is the current tilt, and all of us are capable of tilting the other way, though this may take some extra effort. Hence, the theory of opposites means two competing tendencies which coexist but are dynamically balancing and rebalancing according to external demands and internal preferences. And he believed that some people get cramp, i.e., they get stuck in a rigidified position. Such an approach often fits more readily with a person's perceived reality. Most people do recognize that they have some extroversion and some introversion in them. They sometimes see the big picture, but they sometimes do attend to the small details. Type mapping explores this territory in a clear and illuminating way. Carl Jung developed his theory further because he recognized what he called the problem of one-sided development. Yes, a problem. As I mentioned earlier, he saw that unhappy and unfulfilled people were often stuck. Their behavior had become fixed and rigid, having developed just one side of their character, and his clinical work suggests that this was not healthy, and that acknowledging and valuing both sides of the opposites led to greater satisfaction and a greater ability to adapt to life's challenges. I will direct you to descriptions of his fundamental personality opposites in the next video, part 4, but here I want to make two further points. The first is that he did not see the development of people's opposites as requiring that they become equal, but rather finding a healthy balance that suited an individual's real preferences was desirable. He also suggested that as we mature, we may even transcend the opposites. There's a talk on YouTube called The Fifth Function, if you want to know more about that. So recognizing and valuing and embracing our opposites is a useful lens, and it also suggests that we can learn a lot from the people who irritate us the most, because they often represent that part of ourselves that we have not yet acknowledged and reconciled. Built into this approach is the recognition that all preferences are useful, both in terms of individual psychic health and in terms of managing people and the world around us. The second point I wanted to make was how people who misunderstand type theory try to parody it as putting people into restrictive boxes. Now, anyone who has read and understood Jung knows that he saw type as a compass. That helps us to understand where we have got to in life and helps us to clarify our tilt, our balance, our one-sidedness, which can then open the door to exploring more aspects within ourselves. Hence, the theory is primarily one of growth, change, and increasing flexibility and life satisfaction, a release from the potential rigidity that we may have got into. This is a far more dynamic view than that which is typically associated with personality questionnaires. Against this backdrop, let me suggest that personality is not a set of traits which we measure as differences in degree, but as I said earlier, it is more like a mosaic of characteristics. Perhaps we should regard it more like an MRI scan, where different stimuli activate different parts of us. And another useful metaphor is that of the unfinished painting. We may be born with a basic canvas, with some vague, predetermined outline, but it is life and situations that determine the colours, the order in which they are filled in, and the degree to which the edges are blended or distorted. This incorporates structure with change and suggests how we as individuals continually develop. There are more benefits to the type approach which I would like to explain. So don't turn round, but imagine, as you're watching this screen, you sense something behind you. You feel the hairs on your neck begin to rise. Imagine that I can see it, and I will now describe it to you. Its overall length is 3 feet or 1 meter. It has fur, averaging about an inch or 2.5 centimeters long. It has 4 legs. It has 2 eyes. What is it? Given the list of characteristics, what could it be? Could it be a rabbit or a skunk? But probably neither of those were in your mind given your context. So maybe you thought it's a dog or a cat. Listing measurements of standard characteristics is useful. It narrows it down. But now, if I told you it was a cat, by identifying a class, a category, a type, I can immediately convey an enormous amount of information with many implications, such as diet, night vision, dependence, independence, the care that's needed. Of course, I still don't know what kind of cat, and remember, we are here dealing with self-perception, but type identification is hugely efficient and goes well beyond the sum of individual characteristics. Some people are wedded to a trait approach to describing personality, and they can be quite vociferous in their condemnation of type descriptions. Frankly, many of their arguments are just plain wrong. One being that the existence of continuous scores from a questionnaire is evidence against a type approach. It is not. However, I can embrace both a type and a trait approach. If physics can live with both quantum theory and wave theory, then psychology should be able to live with type and trait as acceptable ways of describing personality. And perhaps type is more aligned with quantum theory due to its discrete elements, and trait is more aligned with wave theory because of its continuous characteristics. So the fundamental reason for developing TDI is to properly recognize that we are made up of many parts, and traditional approaches rely too much on averaging. I mean, consider 5 people in a room. 4 of them earn 10,000 units, and 1, our billionaire, earns 100,000. Average earnings are, therefore, 28,000. Stand up he whom that best describes. None of them. I often use the 4 selves model to summarize the territory before people complete the TDI, or any of the other questionnaires within the type mapping system, as I explained in an earlier video. But let me give a short recap here. A person has both an outer persona and an inner, more private self. But consider how differently you would behave if the head of the mafia walked in, or if these characters did, or if this little girl came in. Each one elicits different behavior, and I call this the contextual self. Where I am clearly influences what I do, and we all play several roles. Now, these acts or roles are not inauthentic, but behind every role there is always a sense of who I really am, which I call the identity self. And whatever your sense of identity, all of us have some image of the person we would like to be, which I call the ideal self. This is a sadly neglected concept in psychometrics, so the TDI fills this gap with a version that allows people to explore differences between who they think they are and who they'd like to be. The TDI is want version. And surprisingly, 75% of the population express a significant difference. Furthermore, self-awareness is never complete. We all have hidden depths. We can all still surprise ourselves. Imagine suddenly being in a war zone or a refugee camp. How would you react? What new things would you discover about your resilience, your bravery, your generosity? Hence, there is always an undiscovered self. When I introduce the TDI, I make it clear that they are being asked to disentangle their sense of identity from their contextual selves, elements that are usually mixed and conflated with the more typical questionnaires. And if they have difficulty separating this being from doing, it can be useful to get them to complete the role questionnaire, the MTRI, first. So the TDI forms part of a bigger picture. Not only does it explore two important elements, the identity and the ideal self, but it uses the same theory to identify 8 behavioural roles, as measured by the MTRI and described in video part 2. And the arrows here form a task or decision-making sequence. This consistency of model allows the TDI to underpin the behavioural roles with that which are most likely to be preferred by their personality. Hence here we can see that activating as a role at the top in green is most likely to be a natural or preferred behaviour for ESTPs and ESFPs. The exploration of what a person does versus what they prefer is fundamental to understanding many different things, such as motivation, competence, stress, excitement, and personal development. And type mapping is part of an even bigger picture. It recognizes complexity. It sees personality as one of several components of a person's identity, represented here by a drum that resonates when hit by the environment. And we are all different drums, making different sounds. So let me elaborate. Here, the drum is schematized, and the noise it makes, how it responds, depends on its size, shape, and materials. And different environmental events make it resonate, and the events can be analyzed using the ITPQ. And different environmental events trigger different elements of the person, such as their role, or perhaps their underlying personality. Sometimes it's their values and their aspirations, or their coping mechanisms. All of these form a person's sense of identity. The reality is that psychometrics has a static view of human attributes, or if not quite static, at least it's backwards looking. Consider major influences within psychology. We have B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, or Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst, or Ray Cattell, the intelligence and personality researcher. All were pioneers and all had very different views of what makes people tick. However, what they all had in common was a reductive view. They sought to explain who I am today by past events, and they're focused on answering the question how I became who I am today. But there is another approach which may be more in tune with people in the learning and development field. For example, Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and Carl Jung, most known for psychological types. Their approach can be described as constructivist. They believe that we are driven by purpose, and hence they focus on where I am going rather than where I have been. And they're trying to answer the question, what am I becoming? This is a fundamentally different question. The former tends towards how people are limited by their past and constitution, and the latter towards how we can shape our own destiny. We are agents in our own future. Of course, the truth is, as ever, a bit of both. Those wishing to facilitate growth and change would find a more dynamic and evolving model more useful. This does not mean that change is then easy, especially where there can be constitutional constraints, but the type mapping model is specifically designed to facilitate awareness, growth, change, and flexibility, which I will describe in the next video. And rather than debate whether personally does or doesn't change, I take the view that we are dealing with people's perceptions and stories. And from that standpoint, I don't believe people transform from caterpillar to butterfly, but I do subscribe to the effects of experience, which, like this block of marble, gets chipped away by life's slings and arrows to reveal the person we become. And how much of that is predestined by the initial block is less interesting than the emerging product. For those who like to capture things succinctly, let me summarize. There is a need for a system that achieves the following. We need greater clarity, not only about what is being measured, but also about what we really mean by personality. And we should no longer ignore context. It is integral to understanding people better. And we need better theories. Personality is often presented as a model, such as the Big Five, which is really just a structure. The real value is when the model has an underpinning theory which generates ideas and provides directions and options. And we need to work with, not on people. This means the approach has to link to people's own reality. People recognize their own flexibility, and so a more dynamic approach makes it easier to connect. And finally, because people are complex, too often they are presented with multiple models, which can be confusing. Learning should be progressive, and so an integrated approach enables the picture to build coherently. To find out more about type mapping, you can watch other videos that focus on different aspects of the approach. Part 1 is an overview of type mapping if you want a broader understanding of the approach. Part 2, team roles using MTRI, is if your primary interest is team or even life roles. And if you want to use these questionnaires, you are welcome to get in touch. Thank you for listening.